Right now, we're joined by Mariana Mazzucato, economics professor at University College London. She has written extensively on national responses to the pandemic and what can be learned from them. She is now the author of Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. Professor, we appreciate the time today. What does Europe need to learn from the disaster that's been the vaccine rollout and shutdowns that they've had to deal with?
Well, first of all, we should remember that, all these different countries in Europe, but also across the globe, are actually performing very differently. It's interesting to see how even some developing countries like Vietnam and the state of Kerala have done quite well on the back of actually investing inside their public administrations over the last decades, precisely in order to handle the different types of crises they've gone through. So what we've seen in Europe is this complete lack of preparedness, even just to get basic stuff like personal protection equipment to frontline workers. This is still a problem in the UK, where I'm standing today. And what's interesting, though, is that, for example, with the vaccine rollout, we've been much more successful here, but not because of any sort of deterministic trend around innovation, but actually because it was nested within the National Health Service in terms of the actual rollout of the vaccine. So within a community-based GP practice, very different, by the way, from how we did the test and trace system, which was outsourced to Deloitte and other consulting companies, and that really did not do too well. So how we govern this crisis matters, how we govern the test and trace system, the digital divide, which is another huge problem for students across the globe that are not accessing today their education in the same way.
Is this a failure of leadership or is this a failure of investment?
I think it's a failure of both. I mean, don't forget that almost all the great things we've done, including going to the moon, 50 years ago, was done with both public and private sectors together. But how they work together was what I say in my book, mission driven. So NASA was very clear on what the goal was, and how they designed the procurement was, the procurement contracts was equally ambitious. They even had a no excess profits clause. And this, by the way, might be useful with the vaccine. The different vaccines we have received $12 billion worth in public funding globally. And yet we're not actually governing that process in such a way that guarantees that, for example, the intellectual property rights don't get abused. This is something that the World Health Organization is calling for. They call for a people's vaccine, where we have a patent pool to actually make sure we have collective intelligence and not rent seeking.
So are the right leaders in charge right now?
Well, again, it depends. For example, you were just talking about the automobile industry before, and what Macron did in France with the COVID recovery scheme. He was quite ambitious and said that he's not there to just, bail out Air France and Renault, but actually to make them better companies. So they had to commit, in order to get the French recovery package, to lowering their carbon emissions over the next years. Whereas in the UK, we just gave, a handout basically to EasyJet, in the sense that, recovery should not just be a bailout. It really needs to do what Biden talks about, which is building back better. But that doesn't happen if you don't nest it within the contracts. And that's why a mission, purpose-driven approach needs to not just be about what's to be done, but how, and how actually to set up really more symbiotic public-private partnerships.
Professor, in the United States thus far, we have subsidized incomes. And now we move on to the next phase of the infrastructure plan. My question is, are we going to see that plan delivering the jobs that the United States needs so desperately? So we are at the moment, I think, in a transition in the States towards big government. The question is that big government going to benefit everybody within the US in terms of the jobs that are going to be provided?
Well, hopefully it will, because don't forget that even after the financial crisis, there was a huge injection of liquidity in the system globally, but also particularly in the US. And unfortunately, most of that just went back to the financial sector. So this time around, we have a much more ambitious plan, both through the ARP, the American Recovery Program, and now the Build Back Better infrastructure investment, which might be up to 3 trillion, 4 trillion. How we actually design that, though, so it really does build back better, depends on what we even mean, for example, by infrastructure. It can't just be cement and bricks. This needs to have a green transition kind of vision around it. The whole Green Deal discussion, which the US was actually kicking off quite a bit before COVID struck. What does it mean to have a green lens on the COVID recovery infrastructure program? That's really where I think a lot of the discussion is going to be at. But again, also how to make sure that we don't just end up bailing out a lot of sectors, but actually help the US economy become less financialized, have corporate governance structures that really do invest in workers and not engage with these massive share buybacks. Something like $4 trillion has been used just to buy back shares in the last 10 years by the large corporate 500 companies. And there's something about making sure that we rethink that as well as part of this Build Back Better strategy. And that needs to be embedded within the conditionalities of the recovery program itself.